I watched the original 1954 Godzilla. This was a request from Jay. I was pleasantly surprised. Obviously, the movie is dated. You just can't get around that with a 70-year-old movie. But the things that the movie does do, writing-wise, I think it does really well. I also really enjoyed the music and the soundtrack overall. And it's pretty awesome that the sound that they used for him in the original is still very similar to the one used now. They did a lot of really great stuff with the sound in this movie. The biggest gripe that I would have with it, because I don't particularly care about bad visuals or special effects in general, but especially with a movie this age, is how in your face the political messaging is. The movie is very, very direct about its anti-nuclear weapon stance. Obviously, given the time, a decade or less after the atomic bombs got dropped in Nagasaki and Hiroshima, I completely understand why the Japanese would be anti-nuclear weapons in general. Even in modern media, from what I've seen, it seems that they still are, despite the fact that they use nuclear power. But aside from that, I actually really like a lot of what the movie does. It's only an hour and a half. It's pretty fast-paced. It really hits all the plot beats that you would want. It does some really good character stuff, I think, in the second half in particular. If I was going to watch a Godzilla movie, honestly, I'd probably just watch Godzilla -1 because that's kind of the more modern take on this. But I think this movie holds up pretty well for being 70 years old. I do think it's absolutely worth watching if you haven't seen it. And I totally get how it inspired a bajillion sequels, even if they devolve into crazy, goofy nonsense more often than not. The way the movie was shot, the way that they designed Godzilla, despite their limitations at the time, the music, I definitely like that this movie leans way more into the horror component than some of the dumber MonsterVerse movies that lean into the action, sci-fi ridiculousness of it. And for the limited runtime of the movie, they really fit a lot in. You get a love story, you get social commentary, you get a big scary monster using fire breath, laying waste to the city. You get some insight into the more rural aspects of the culture and their mythology. It does a lot, and I think it does a lot of things pretty well, considering the runtime constraints along with the technological ones. I did have a bit of a hard time following the beginning just because it jumps around so much to so many people and places. Still Godzilla, still pretty easy to follow. Some ships go missing, they send more ships out, they go missing, and then once you finally see the monster, people are like, oh shit. Pretty typical. Obviously, the ones making the formula deserve a lot more appreciation than the ones who reuse and retool it in the modern day. I really like the arguments that are had throughout the movie. Pretty early on, you see giant footprints of radioactivity. The rural people are frustrated that their well water in that part of the area, they're being told not to use it now, obviously because of the radiation. And then once they see the monster and accept it in the city, for the politicians and the scientists, they have their own issues to deal with. One of the issues that we see debated is whether or not to reveal this information to the public. You have one side saying, this is a side effect of the H-bombs. We're already on delicate diplomatic terms. We can't just go announcing things like this to the public. We should keep it internal. And the other side is saying we need to be transparent and let people know what kind of danger they're in, these side effects of the H-bomb testing. And I definitely think that's a real argument that would happen, especially in the aftermath of World War II, which is the context for this movie. It would be a really delicate thing to deal with, especially given the technology at the time. Obviously, it's not like today where we could see Godzilla from fucking space. And something else that's pretty smart throughout the movie that they do is show different newspaper headlines about how now there's disaster response centers set up, more ships going missing, kind of the regular people being like, we already dealt with Nagasaki, now we're dealing with a fucking monster. And it really helps with the horror element of how much destruction and damage Godzilla is actually causing off screen. If they had the ability, they might have wanted to show it, but because of limitations back then, it is off screen. And in some ways, I think that works better. There's classic movies like Jaws that use this kind of implied threat looming over you that you don't know what it is really, very effectively. Aliens, same kind of thing. there's a mentality that's actually taught in some business schools about trying to constrain the amount of options you have to increase the creativity that you use to solve a problem. And because of the technology at the time, the constraints they had, they do a lot of workarounds that I think are pretty effective for a movie, where a movie today might be a little bit more self-indulgent and you would just get this big CGI monster blowing up everything because they have the capacity to. You also get a bit more of the scientific perspective, but I'm glad they don't go too crazy with it and make him just completely unlikable with Yamane, where he is kind of like, we can't kill this monster. It can survive H-bombs. It's radioactive. And not only can we not kill it literally, even if we could, we should be trying to study it and its survival abilities. I like that he's just kind of depressed about it. He's not saying they should sacrifice human lives. He's just kind of down about the missed scientific opportunity. And it also seems pretty relevant to the time, given the effects of the radiation on the Japanese people, that if you could study something that could survive radiation and possibly make a medication, whatever the case may be, would be really useful and help save a lot of lives. And at this point in the film, Godzilla has been destructive, but not massacring entire cities, really. And I also just feel like if that was today, you would just get some fucking line that was like, oh, if only the virus known as humanity didn't exist, Godzilla could live in peace, stomping the earth to his content, or some dumb bullshit. My favorite part of the movie, besides Godzilla, is probably the relationship between Emiko Serizawa and Ogata. I don't fucking know. I'm terrible with the names. But Emiko calls off her arranged marriage with Serizawa for Ogata. And Serizawa ends up being the one who has a solution on how to kill Godzilla. Serizawa creates a new weapon, and they throw some sci-fi mumbo jumbo out there about it, splitting the oxygen atoms and whatever. But he calls it the oxygen destroyer, which is essentially like the atomic bomb equivalent for water. And it can turn a body of water into an aquatic graveyard, the way that he describes it, by essentially destroying all the oxygen and suffocating out all of the life there. But he promises her to secrecy, and it's a secret that she keeps because as of yet, Godzilla, relatively speaking, hasn't done a ton of damage to Japan. And I also relate the conflict that this leads to between Emiko's father, Yamane, and Ogata, because he's more of a military-minded guy. He wants to kill Godzilla, and Yamane obviously wants to study him. So he's like, get out of my house, get out of my life, fuck off, right before Ogata can ask for permission to propose to Emiko. Some nice little interpersonal drama there because of their beliefs and worldviews. And then we finally get a big attack from Godzilla where he just fucks stuff up. I'm sure it was pretty awesome at the time. Obviously, kind of had to just enjoy it for what it is now. But even still, despite the age, you get some pretty cool shots. If you take a step back in a meta sense, you know it's just a guy in a costume on some kind of model set. But for the movie, I think it's pretty cool seeing the town's on fire, him using his heat breath on everything, just really wrecking shit. They use a lot of smart camera angles by zooming in to him stepping on things to really give him the appearance of being huge, because he's supposed to be like 50 meters. And the music itself is just awesome. I did not realize that the Godzilla -1 music was either the same or very slightly modified from the original.
I'm gonna be honest with you. I'm kind of retarded.
The one issue I would have with Godzilla in general as a sound thing would be that when he steps, they don't usually give it any like weight or camera shaking or anything, which you would definitely get now, obviously. But he's still stepping on shit, so you know that he's huge. And also when you combine that with the giant footprints you see earlier in the movie. A lot of little shots like these I think are really neat. And the black and white, to me, kind of works well for it, where it's all really dark and kind of hard to see. And then the fire is like the only lighting source for the movie, it seems like. So you just have this giant Godzilla silhouette roaming across your city, fucking stuff up. And you get some pretty cool shots throughout of him messing up bridges, having a train in his mouth, really just walking destruction for Japan. A super effective way to show how horrific he is as a monster, how scary he is. And then obviously the parallel with the atomic bombs that the movie really wants to hammer home. And it's really great how much they thought of, where you do have your fighter jets coming in, shooting him, they're launching missiles at him, and he he's just not really being dealt any kind of significant damage. And again, just helping to really reinforce how scary he is. He can't even be taken down by the military. And of course, the humans weren't completely stupid. They had tried to set up giant power lines as a kind of a barrier. So they do try a bunch of things before they get desperate for a solution. And this all leads to Emiko breaking her promise to Serizawa and telling Ogata about what she saw in the lab and that she thinks there is a way to kill Godzilla. And I really like this as a piece of character work for her because she wanted to keep a promise to someone that she had a close relationship with. And because that's what was asked of her, she did keep it until she saw this level of destruction and decided that it was more important to break the promise and get the information out than to keep the promise while people are just suffering and dying everywhere. And to me, this is probably the best stuff of the movie where they're having this conversation and Serizawa was like, look, I don't want to introduce more weapons into this really destructive arms race. We've got H-bombs, we've got atomic bombs. If I introduce the oxygen destroyer and we can destroy water sources on a whim, what is that going to do to cause things to escalate? What is that going to do to cause the amount of people dying? And it's all pretty fair points. And he even says, you know, once this was made public, do you think the politicians would just leave me alone, or the military? They would force me into creating more of it, continuing the escalation, continuing the destruction. And that's not what I want to do, which leads to actually a little scuffle. And eventually he relents because if he doesn't give in, Godzilla might actually destroy Japan or the world, given enough time, if there's no way to stop him. And the end is actually a part where I think the lack of technology adds to the tension, because we end up with Serizawa saying the device has to be deployed underwater, so I'm going to dive down. And if you don't know, back then the diving suits were essentially just hoses connected to the air up top, and you had a rope tied to you they could pull you up with. Super brute force way to go diving. And Ogata says, you can't go alone, I'll go with you, I'm an experienced diver. So obviously you get your two guys in their little love triangle going together, your scientist and your fighter working as a team, putting their lives on the line. You have Yamane watching along with Erica. All your pieces have come together for this final part. And I really like it that you get to see them kind of slowly crawling along the seafloor. You see Godzilla, who they found with their Geiger counter, and then Serizawa deploys the device and signals for Ogata to get pulled back up top while he stays behind to activate it and cut his own line in his last act of self-sacrifice. And I think that's a pretty cool and heroic moment where he decides to take Godzilla out. But he also knows now that this device has been deployed and observed, if he exists, he'll be forced to recreate it. So he cuts his own line and sacrifices himself as well to ensure that the oxygen destroyer can't be replicated now that all of his research is destroyed and he's gone as well. And the last thing that he does is wish Emiko and Ogata happiness. Godzilla gives one last screaming death cry, and the movie ends with kind of a call to put down the nuclear weapons and escalation, and that Godzilla could come back if we continue creating these type of weapons. Again, really in your face, really direct. I don't know if that's a cultural thing, an era thing, a translation thing, but it is. And that's Godzilla. Overall, obviously old, but a really well-constructed movie. A lot of really interesting character and moral stuff discussed. And it's pretty easy to see why it spawned entire universes and was my favorite toy as a kid. You had the 90s anime, Godzuki. But yeah, I don't know if I'd ever sit down and just pop it on just because of how dated it is. But I'm glad that it led to things like -1, which I will absolutely just sit down and pop on because it's a great movie that's very heavily inspired by the original in a lot more ways than I realized when I first saw it, since I hadn't seen the original. I'm going to leave it there for this one. This was both an interesting and a good pick from Jay. I think it's worth watching at least once just so you can see the origins of Godzilla. If you've seen it, let me know what you think. I try to respond to the comments that aren't just insults, like and subscribe and all that shit. Thanks. See ya.